On the 13th of February 1542, Katheryn Howard, the fifth wife of King Henry VIII, was escorted from her chambers inside the Tower of London to the place of execution. She would not face the baying crowds of London, but instead be executed privately. Eustace Chapuis, the imperial ambassador to the court of Henry VIII, claimed that she died on the very same spot where just 6 years earlier her cousin and fellow Queen consort Anne Boleyn had met the same fate. Unlike Anne Boleyn, however, there was to be no special allowances made on this day, no French expert swordsman who would ensure a swift and clean end to her life, no solemn draping of black cloth around the scaffold as a mark of Katheryn's former rank. Anne Boleyn's execution, while still a grisly affair, had a certain level of protocol weaved into the way that it was carried out that made her end feel starkly more regal. The death of a queen, even one condemned as a traitor, should carry with it a certain level of respect and ceremony. The stark difference that greeted Katheryn Howard on the scaffold in 1542 is seen by many as further proof of the possible stab of conscience or pity that Henry VIII felt towards Anne Boleyn but did not extend to Katheryn 6 years later. This is perhaps compounded by the fact that unlike Anne Boleyn, it would appear that Katheryn Howard was indeed guilty of the charges brought against her. But should we pause when condemning Katheryn as an airhead harlot, as she is so often portrayed, and consider whether she may have been as much a victim as a traitor? Welcome back to the Tudor Chest Podcast, Episode 12, The Life and Death of Katheryn Howard. Despite Henry VIII not ordering an expert swordsman to dispatch his fifth queen, there would be one strange allowance made for Katheryn Howard, and it was one made at her own request. It's a most curious story, but upon being told that she would die at 7 a.m. on Monday the 13th of February 1542, she requested that the block on which she would lay her head the following morning be brought to her cell. Katheryn wanted to practice laying her head upon it. She supposedly practiced for several hours, perhaps hoping that doing so would make the experience a few hours later seem less frightening somehow. It's a chilling prospect, but appears entirely in keeping with Katheryn's own character. Her biographer, Gareth Russell, suggests that one of Katheryn's overwhelming character traits, or flaws, was a hatred of embarrassment. By practicing her own death, was she hoping to avoid any potential embarrassment the following day? Katheryn was, by most historians' reckoning, no more than 19 years old at the time of her death, and has repeatedly been labelled as nothing more than an idiotic floozy, made no better by her relatively inaccurate portrayals in film and television. And yet here she was, acting out a strangely macabre dress rehearsal of her own death. This alone suggests a woman of significantly greater depth of character than we've been led to believe, and someone who was also determined to do her job properly right up to the end. She was, after all, a Howard, easily the most prominent noble family in the country behind the Tudors themselves. Despite Katheryn's heritage, her upbringing could hardly be called intensely glamorous or remotely conventional for someone with the surname of Howard. She had the misfortune of being born to Lord Edmund Howard, the third son of Thomas Howard, 2nd Duke of Norfolk. It would appear that Edmund was something of an ineffectual tertiary figure at the court of Henry VIII, never sharing in the respect and favour that the king bestowed upon Edmund's two older brothers, particularly the eldest, Thomas, who would become the infamous 3rd Duke of Norfolk in time. With that said, Edmund did at times appear to benefit from his position in the second family of the land, most notably with his appointment of Controller of Calais in 1531, perhaps under the influence of his niece, Anne Boleyn. Sadly, it would not last. Edmund would be dismissed in 1539 after years of ineffectual leadership, achieving nothing and earning him less money than he had started with. And herein lies Edmund's biggest problem: money. Despite being a Howard, he was not the all-important heir, or even the spare. He was the spare of the spare, and so Edmund was forever short of money. This wasn't unusual. A lot of noble houses in England suffered with incomes incommensurate with the expected grandeur that they were meant to project. This was invariably not helped by the fact that the nobility often had large families, as Edmund himself did, with 6 children by his wife Joyce Culpeper, who herself had 5 children by her deceased first husband, which then became Edmund's financial responsibility as well. It would also seem that what little money he did have, he was not remotely sensible with. After utterly burning through his wife Joyce's highly valuable lands in Kent and Hampshire, Edmund was forced to flee to Europe to avoid his creditors, leaving his many children to be brought up by relatives. As the 5th child of the 3rd son of the Duke of Norfolk, Katheryn Howard's early life was therefore not the glittering Mecca that you might expect from such a high-born young woman in Tudor England, and certainly not the upbringing for anyone who ever imagined that she would one day become queen. Likely born in around 1523, Katheryn was sent to live with her step-grandmother, Agnes Tilney, the Dowager Duchess of Norfolk, at her estate in Horsham in Sussex. Katheryn's mother had died in 1528, and as the Dowager Duchess had major households in both London and Sussex, Katheryn, along with some of her siblings, moved in with their step-grandmother, who took in many wards. You get the sense that the Dowager Duchess's household was a bit like a sort of gigantic dorm, just full of random waifs and strays from across the Howard network, and truth be told, that's probably what it was like. As Dowager Duchess of Norfolk, Agnes was one of the highest ranking women in England. As such, she was expected to spend the majority of her time away at the court, which unfortunately led to the supervision of her young charges becoming somewhat lax. Soon, Katheryn was being influenced by older girls in her household who allowed men into their sleeping quarters at night. It would appear that the young men and women of the household enjoyed each other's company, often drinking wine and eating food stolen from the kitchens. I'm inclined to believe that there may have been plenty of flirting, what we might now call heavy petting, a bit of upstairs outdoors going on, but I feel it prudent to exercise some caution with the theory that it was an all-out sex fest as depicted in Showtime series The Tudors. Consider that this was an age before effective contraception, but more importantly one that placed enormous weight on a woman's virtue, especially high-born women, even ones of impoverished parents. If there was even a whiff of suspicion that a young woman had not been properly chaste, then her prospects in high society were practically zero. Katheryn would have known this fact all too well. Despite her position as a Howard, Katheryn was not well educated, although her ability to read and write was certainly considered impressive for the time. What cannot be overlooked is that she was considerably far less worldly, far less educated than her cousin, Anne Boleyn. She was described as vivacious and giggly, but never serious or scholarly. She was reported as being an accomplished dancer, but was easily distracted and appears to have been rather frivolous. I would, however, highlight that at this time she was probably around 13 to 14 years old, and was therefore acting exactly as how many young teenagers behave. By 1536, Katheryn had begun music lessons with a man called Henry Manox. Unfortunately, very little is known about how Manox came to be in the Dowager Duchess's household, but what is certainly accepted by historians is that soon some type of relationship between Manox and Katheryn became more than merely that of teacher and student. Some historians have put forward the theory that Katheryn and Manox's relationship became abusive, with Manox preying upon Katheryn and encouraging her to lose her virginity to him. Manox soon began gossiping about his apparent conquest of Katheryn, which greatly angered and embarrassed her. It does, however, appear to have just been mere gossip, as Manox himself would admit years later, during Katheryn's investigation, that they had engaged in a form of sexual conduct but had not gone the whole way. Katheryn's own testimony would mirror Manox's perfectly. By 1539, Katheryn sufficiently distanced herself from Manox and began to be pursued by another hanger-on of the household, Francis Derham. Katheryn Howard and Derham soon became lovers, although whether they went through full sexual intimacy is not completely clear. However, they did begin addressing each other, perhaps playfully, as husband and wife. When Derham was away, he entrusted Katheryn to manage his finances, which not only highlights that Katheryn, if she were able to manage a budget, was more highly educated than we've been led to believe, but also the fact that Katheryn and Derham did appear to be acting like a genuine couple. Catherine's life would soon change beyond all recognition when her uncle, the Duke of Norfolk, secured a position for her in the household of Henry VIII's fourth wife, Anna of Cleves. Perhaps sensing the end of Thomas Cromwell via the absolute disaster that was the Cleves marriage, Norfolk began to move against him. He saw an opportunity to elevate the Howards back to the enormous influence that they had enjoyed under Anne Boleyn, who via her mother was a niece of the Duke of Norfolk, and thus a full first cousin of Katheryn Howard. Katheryn soon caught the king's eye, and within months of her arrival at court, she would be bestowed with great gifts of land, expensive cloth, furs, and jewellery. After the king managed to sufficiently annul his 6-month marriage to Anna of Cleves, he proposed to Katheryn, and on the 28th of July 1540, they were married, the very same day that Thomas Cromwell would lose his head on the executioner's scaffold. At the time of their marriage, Katheryn may have been as young as just 16 years old, although it's more probable that she was nearer 18. Either way, by now the king was 49, grossly obese, plagued with ill health, and an ulcer in his leg that never healed and reportedly smelt dreadful. In fact, it was said that it could be smelt from 3 rooms away from where the king was. It is not hard to imagine, therefore, that Katheryn must surely have felt a certain amount of horror at what she was being married to, even if it propelled her to the very top of Tudor society. Thanks to the television dramas such as The 6 Wives of Henry VIII, or more prominently The Tudors, Katheryn's tenure as queen has been viewed as one filled with nothing but shopping, dancing and drinking, a Tudor Marie Antoinette, if you will. However, whilst it's true that Katheryn did definitely enjoy the trappings of royalty, this did not make her unusual, for Anne Boleyn, Jane Seymour and Catherine Parr all spent lavishly on clothing and their households. Equally, this does not mean that she wasn't a dutiful queen who understood the role that she had been raised to. From the official records, it becomes clear that it was quite the contrary, for Katheryn fulfilled her ceremonial role with aplomb. The theory that she was an airhead with little care for duty or the sanctity of her role as queen consort has zero contemporary basis, and when one looks more closely, there is simply no evidence to back up this assessment. I think it's undeniable that she was probably quite naive and at times felt very out of her depth, but it seems to me unfair to label her as anything more than that without irrefutable proof to say otherwise. Unfortunately for Katheryn, she could not truly escape her past in Horsham. It was always going to come back and haunt her. It is believed that people from her time in Horsham, no doubt intent on riding on her queenly coattails, began to pressure Katheryn into providing favour to them in exchange for their silence on the past. The beginning of the end for Katheryn occurred when her fellow childhood ward, Mary Lascelles, refused her brother John's request to secure him a position in the Queen's household. Mary had claimed that she had bore witness to Katheryn's loose living during their time in Horsham, and upon hearing this, John reported his findings to Thomas Cranmer, Archbishop of Canterbury. Under interrogation from Cranmer, Mary Lascelles confessed that Katheryn had had a sexual relationship in her past, which included the promise of marriage, thus nullifying her marriage to the king. In Tudor England, words around marriage were just as binding as deeds themselves, and so simply expressing the wish to be married and referring to each other as husband and wife was enough technically to constitute a binding marriage pact in the eyes of God and the court, no doubt spotting an opportunity to greatly discredit the ardently Catholic Howards, who had also been responsible for the fall of his friend Thomas Cromwell. Thomas Cranmer, who was an equally fervent Protestant, took charge of the case now beginning to build around the Queen. At this stage, however, Katheryn's actions were enough to remove her from the position of Queen and nullify her marriage, but would not have resulted in her death. She could be banished in disgrace, but she would have at least remained alive. That was until the interrogation of Jane Boleyn, Lady Rochford, the widow of George Boleyn and therefore the sister-in-law of Queen Anne Boleyn. Under questioning, Lady Rochford confessed to assisting in an adulterous relationship between Queen Katheryn and Thomas Culpeper, a courtier and close friend of King Henry VIII, and it was this that utterly changed everything. It was one thing to lie about your past, but another thing entirely to actively engage in an adulterous relationship with a member of the king's own household. Perhaps fearing the outcome of taking the news directly to the king, Cranmer orchestrated a letter to be placed onto the pew from which King Henry was praying in the Chapel Royal of Hampton Court Palace, detailing the accusations against Katheryn Howard. On November the 7th, Cranmer moved against the Queen, questioning her alongside a delegation of councillors at Winchester Palace, just south of London. Cranmer found the Queen in a pitiful state, commenting that, "I found her in such lamentation and heaviness as I never saw no creature, so that it would have pitied any man's heart to have looked upon her." Such was his concern for her mental well-being that he ordered the guards to remove any objects that she might use to commit suicide. Despite the fact that it might have spared Katheryn's life, she denied any pre-contract with Francis Derham, instead insisting that she had been repeatedly raped by him during their time together in Horsham. By November 23rd, Katheryn was stripped of her title as Queen, and just 8 days later, both Culpeper and Derham were on trial for high treason. Manox somehow managed to sufficiently distance himself from the proceedings. The verdict of guilty was a foregone conclusion, and both were sentenced to a traitor's death of hanging, drawing and quartering. Despite Derham being arguably the less guilty party, it was he who would suffer this truly horrific form of execution. Thomas Culpeper, through his affinity to King Henry VIII, had his sentence commuted to the swifter method of death by decapitation. Through the winter of 1541 and early 1542, Katheryn was imprisoned at Sion Abbey. Many of Katheryn's relatives were also imprisoned in the Tower of London, with the exception of her uncle, the wily Duke of Norfolk, easily one of history's biggest twats, who had sufficiently distanced himself from the whole affair. Katheryn herself remained in a weird state of limbo, not knowing how the court would move against her. The Royal Assent by Commission Act of 1541 made it treason and punishable by death for a Queen Consort to fail to disclose her sexual history to the King within 20 days of their marriage, or to incite someone to commit adultery with her. This was the legal technicality that robbed Katheryn of her future. She was guilty as charged. No trial would be necessary. Lady Rochford had also become complicit in her actions to facilitate Culpeper and the Queen's meetings, and was therefore sentenced to death alongside Katheryn Howard. As I referenced at the start of this episode, the night before her execution, Katheryn spent a lot of time practicing how to lay her head onto the block. She was said to die with relative composure, but looked pale and terrified, being barely able to speak. Her scaffold speech stuck to the custom of the day, acknowledging her faults and describing her punishment as worthy and just. The belief that she said, "I die a queen, but would rather have died the wife of Culpeper," is complete nonsense and has zero contemporary source to back it up. There is also no evidence to back up the depiction as seen in the Tudors, where Katheryn loses all ability to hold on to her bodily functions and wet herself on the scaffold. Again, didn't happen. Mercifully, Katheryn's execution was swift. She was beheaded with a single blow of the axe. During her imprisonment, Jane Boleyn, Lady Rochford, had suffered a complete mental breakdown, which would have normally seen her avoid punishment, but so determined was Henry to see her suffer that he pushed through a change in the law, and she was therefore duly executed not long after Katheryn. It's entirely possible that the scaffold was still covered in Katheryn's blood. Both women were buried inside the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula. During the restoration work done on the chapel during the reign of Queen Victoria, the space where Katheryn was said to be buried was dug up, but no remains were found. It is believed that the limestone used to intern her simply turned her bones to dust, having not sufficiently hardened with age prior to her death. The question, however, is, was Katheryn truly guilty? Did she genuinely sleep with these men without a thought for the wider repercussions of her actions? To understand this properly, one has to separate our own views on sexuality and contemporary gender behaviour to remember that England in the 1540s was an incredibly different place on practically every level. We cannot say that we can truly think like a Tudor, because we can't. In November 1541, Katheryn confessed to her sexual relations with Francis Derham, testifying that Francis Derham, by many persuasions, procured me to his vicious purpose. We have scant records of Katheryn's feelings and actions, but not once do we have anything to suggest that she personally enjoyed the affair with Derham or potentially with Manox. I reiterate again, Katheryn was a member of one of the most important noble families in the kingdom, in which family members were married off to other noble families to strengthen ties between them. It does not seem likely, therefore, that Katheryn would enter into sexual relationships with no consideration for her future or the reputation of her family. She may have been born low down the Howard pecking order, but it was still a noble pecking order, and she would have known her place. We also need to consider that Tudor England was built around severe patriarchy. The actions of men carried much greater weight in testimony, with women often being viewed as weak and easily led by their desires. Crucially, women were viewed as deliberately sexually voracious. They would seek the means to belittle and bring down their male counterparts. Male testimony, in other words, counted for a lot more. Men had a natural advantage in Tudor England, with the default assumption that Derham was speaking the truth, whilst Katheryn must surely have lied. Crucially, the act of remaining silent under questioning led to a belief that the woman in question could not be trusted, and because Katheryn remained silent about her own past sexual experiences, she was naturally viewed with suspicion by her investigators. What is seldom touched on but is clear is that Katheryn, by this point, was really beginning to suffer, for she said to Thomas Cranmer, "The sorrow of my offences was ever before my eyes." Although the Queen did confess to unsavoury communication with Manox and Derham and to meeting with Culpeper, she refused to state that she was guilty of adultery. Looking through a 2023 lens, we simply cannot apply our own outlook on female sexuality against that of 16th century England. When studying Katheryn, we have to ensure that we review contemporary gender codes of behaviour through the beliefs of the time and not through our own worldview. Our predisposition to blame the female has to stop, but must instead be viewed from both sides of the argument. Not doing so lands us in the trap of writing Katheryn off as nothing more than an empty-headed harlot. To me, it appears much more likely that she was the victim of early modern notions of sexual coercion and blame, in which her male counterparts were privileged and female victims viewed with distrust. Historians should look to reassess their own findings on Katheryn and try to step outside our own modern-day perspective to try and apply the societal norms of the day and just how much this defined Katheryn Howard's story. Katheryn Howard was queen for just 18 months. Her relatively short reign and generally minimal impact on British history has undoubtedly contributed to her being one of King Henry VIII's more forgettable queens. The centuries of name-calling towards her, airhead, tart, floozy, have, however, in the past few years, began to soften. Whilst I've always found her to be one of the most fascinating of Henry VIII's queens, her overall life, reign and downfall has been irrevocably changed by modern biographers, most prominently in the work of Gareth Russell and his incredible book, Young and Damned and Fair. I do not know the full details, but I believe a full-length documentary about Katheryn is also on the horizon, and I sincerely hope that it looks to reassess much of what we have been told to believe about her story. Katheryn may be well less known than some of her contemporaries, but what cannot be denied is that of the 6 wives of Henry VIII, she was one of, if not the most tragic. She was a teenager, born to a great name, but no great riches, then likely abused, married off to a man old enough to be her grandfather, who 18 months later authorised her execution. By any standards, that's a truly tragic tale, even if it did include a brief period in which she became the most elevated woman in England. Given the brevity of her reign and what it eventually led to, I doubt even Katheryn herself would have chosen to do it all again had she had the chance. And so, that brings me to the end of this week's episode of the Tudor Chess Podcast. Thank you so much for listening. In addition to this, my weekly episode, I also release a weekly subscriber-only episode via my Patreon account, patreon.com/The Tudor Chest, or on Apple Podcast subscriptions. Just search for The Tudor Chess Podcast. Next time, I'm going to be exploring the life of the man for whom we owe so much, the man who gave us a window into the world of the Tudors, the court painter to Henry VIII, Hans Holbein. I'm incredibly excited that on Thursday of this week, I'm going to a press launch of a new exhibition of Hans Holbein's work at Buckingham Palace, and I'll be sure to discuss that in the episode. Thank you again for your support of the Tudor Chest, and speak soon.